Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's deep dive into one of the most infamous, decisive, and perplexing films in the history of horror cinema. Wes Craven's directorial debut, The Last House on the Left. Released in 1972, this film stands as a cultural and cinematic artifact that has sparked debates for decades. It is revered by some as a gritty masterpiece of grindhouse cinema, while others regard it as exploitative mess with little artistic merit. Today, I'll be diving deep into this film, dissecting its merits and, more importantly, its many, many flaws. Spoiler alert. In my view, this film does not live up to the reputation it has somehow garnered over the years. In fact, it is deserving of no more than a 1 out of 10, and I will explain why over the next 10 minutes. This analysis will explore everything from the film's narrative failures, its problematic portrayal of violence, its bizarre tonal shifts, and its overall lack of cohesion. Let us begin with a brief overview of the film's origins and plot. Directed by Wes Craven and produced by Sean S. Cunningham, The Last House on the Left was initially conceived as a low-budget exploitation film with an explicit aim to shock. Craven, who would later become an horror icon with films like A Nightmare on Elm Street and Scream, was a novice director at the time, and this film clearly reflects that. The film was loosely based on The Virgin Spring, a 1960 film directed by Ingmar Bergman, which itself was an adaptation of a Swedish ballet which I can't pronounce the name of. The plot of The Last House on the Left is, at its core, simple. Two teenage girls, Mari Collingwood, played by Sandra Peabody, and her friend Phyllis Stone, played by Lucy Gratham, head out for a night of fun, planning to attend a concert. On their way, they encounter a gang of sadistic criminals. Krug Stillo, played by David Hess, his heroin-addicted son Junior, played by Mark Scheffler, Fred Weasel Podolsky, played by Fred Lincoln, and Sadie, played by Jeremy Rain, a deranged woman who seems to derive pleasure from cruelty. The gang kidnaps the girls, brutally tortures, rapes, and eventually murders them. In a cruel twist of fate, the gang seeks refuge in the home of Mari's parents, who eventually discover what happened to their daughter and exact a brutal revenge on the criminals. At first glance, this sounds like a recipe for a tense, harrowing film, one that could explore deep themes of revenge, justice, and the consequences of violence. However, The Last House on the Left fails to deliver on these promises. Instead, what we get is a disjointed, tonally confused, and at times outright laughable film that squanders its potential at every turn. One of the film's most glaring flaws is its tone. The Last House on the Left is a film that can't decide what it wants to be. Is it a grim and gritty exploitation film, or is it a bizarre dark comedy? Craven seems to want it both ways, but the result is a film that is widely inconsistent in tone, making it impossible for the viewer to engage with the material on any meaningful level. One moment, we are watching a brutal scene of sexual violence, and the next, we are treated to slapstick comedy involving bumbling cops who wouldn't be out of place in a cartoon. These shifts in tone are not just jarring, they are completely undermining. They destroy any tension the film manages to build and leave the viewer confused and disconnected from the narrative. Let's take a closer look at the infamous music choices in this film.
Taking them girls, you know? That's the kind of crime people never forgive you for. Sex crime.
Shut up, Weasel, you're disturbing my rhythm.
How we get into this sex crime business anyway? My brother Saul, a plumber?
The score, composed by David Hess, who also plays the sadistic Krug, is a baffling mix of 1960s folk music and jaunty tunes that are entirely at odds with the brutal violence unfolding on screen. We are treated to a whimsical, almost upbeat music that feels like it belongs in a completely different film. The dissonance between the music and the visuals is so extreme that it pulls the viewer out of the experience entirely, or at least it did in my experience. Instead of amplifying the horror, the music of the film undermines the horror, making the film feel like a bizarre parody of itself. It's as if Craven was intending to be edgy and subversive by contrasting the violence with cheerful music, but instead, it just comes across as a colossal misfire. The use of music in horror films is crucial. When done correctly, it can heighten tension, create an atmosphere of dread, and leave a lasting impact on the audience. In The Last House on the Left, the music feels like it was chosen at random, with little thought given to how it would affect the overall tone and mood of the film. The acting in The Last House of the Left is another major issue. While Sandra Peabody and Lucy Gratham do their best with the limited material they are given, their performances are ultimately undermined by a script that treats them as little more than objects of violence and suffering. The film never allows them to be fully fleshed out characters. We don't know much about Mari or Phyllis beyond the fact that they are two teenage girls who make the terrible mistake of trusting the wrong people. As a result, when the violence begins, it feels exploitative rather than impactful. We are not invested in these characters, and so their suffering lacks emotional weight. The performances of the villains, particularly David Hess's Krug, are similarly one note. Hess plays Krug as a sadistic, snarling brute, but there is no depth to the character. He is simply evil for the sake of being evil, with no real motivation or backstory to explain his cruelty. This lack of depth makes the character feel cartoonish rather than terrifying. The same can be said for Fred Lincoln as Weasel, and even Jeremy Renner as Sadie. They are little more than caricatures of psychopaths lacking any real humanity or true complexity. Richard Towers and Elena Shore, who play Mary's parents, give performances that are so stiff and wooden that it's hard to take them seriously. Their emotional reactions to their daughter's death and their eventual revenge feels more like a series of awkward slapstick moments than a cathartic release of grief and anger. There is one scene in particular where Mari's father spreads shaving cream on the floor in an attempt to set a trap for Krug. It's a moment that is so absurdly out of place that it's hard not to laugh. This is supposed to be a moment in the film of high tension, but instead it feels like something out of a bad comedy. The film's portrayal of violence is another major problem. The Last House on the Left is often cited as one of the most brutal and disturbing films of its time, and there's no denying that the violence in this film is graphic and explicit. The rape and torture scenes are prolonged and viscous, lingering on the suffering of the victims in a way that feels exploitive rather than meaningful. There is no deeper commentary on violence or its impact. There is only the violence itself. The film seems to revel in the brutality it depicts without offering any meaningful commentary on it. As a result, the violence feels hollow, serving no purpose other than to shock to the audience. This leads us to the film's central theme of revenge, which is another area where The Last House on the Left falls flat. Revenge is a common theme in horror films, and when handled well, it can provide a powerful emotional payoff. However, in this film, the revenge plot is handled so poorly that it feels anticlimactic. When Mary's parents discover what has happened to their daughter, they plot their revenge in the most convoluted and absurd ways possible. Instead of feeling the weight of their grief and anger, we are treated to scenes of them setting up slapstick traps and awkwardly bumbling their way through their revenge. There is one scene in particular that stands out for just how fucking ridiculous it is. Estelle, Mary's mother, decides to seduce Weasel, one of the criminals, in order to exact her revenge. She performs oral sex on him before biting off his fucking penis.
Oh, sweet mama. Here I come.
A moment that is clearly meant to shock, but instead feels absurd and out of place. The entire sequence is so poorly executed that it's hard to take it seriously. What should have been a moment of cathartic vengeance instead becomes an unintentionally comedic farce. This scene exemplifies the film's confused tonal identity. Rather than delivering the gut-wrenching emotional impact one would expect from a revenge sequence, it undermines the gravity of the situation. In many ways, The Last House on the Left fails to understand the core mechanics of what makes revenge narratives compelling. Successful revenge films delve into the psychology of their characters, exploring how the act of vengeance affects both the victim and the perpetrator. Take the incredible film from 2003, Old Boy, for example. Old Boy examines the moral and emotional complexities of revenge, questioning whether such actions truly provide resolution or simply perpetuate a cycle of violence. Craven's film does not engage with these ideas at all. Instead, it treats revenge as a shallow plot device, where the emphasis is not on the emotional or ethical implications of the parents' actions, but rather on the brutality and spectacle of their revenge. The cinematography and visual style also leaves much to be desired, in my opinion. While some might argue that the film's gritty, low-budget aesthetic adds to its sense of realism, the result, in my opinion, is more amateurish than atmospheric. The film's visual language is flat and uninspired, with little attention paid to the framing, the composition, or the lighting. Now, some defenders of The Last House on the Left might argue that its raw, unpolished style is part of its charm, that it reflects the rough, guerrilla filmmaking techniques of the era and adds to its sense of authenticity. But I would argue that this rawness is more indicative of the film's overall lack of craftsmanship. There is a difference between a film that uses a low-budget aesthetic to enhance its narrative and a film that simply looks cheap because it was made with little skill or care. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre from 1974, for example, was also a low-budget production, but it uses its gritty aesthetic to create a sense of claustrophobia and dread. In contrast, The Last House on the Left, when you compare it to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, feels like a student film, disorganized, amateurish, and ultimately ineffective. Craven has spoken in interviews about how he wanted The Last House on the Left to be a commentary on violence and its representation in cinema. He was reportedly inspired by the sanitized depictions of violence in mainstream films and wanted to create something that showed the true horrors of violence without glamorizing or sanitizing it. In theory, this is a laudable goal, and I'm sure as a young filmmaker just starting out, he had the best intentions. However, the execution falls far short of his ambition. This brings us to the broader cultural impact of The Last House on the Left. Despite its many flaws, the film has developed a cult following over the years, and it is often cited as a seminal work in horror genre, but I would argue that its influence is overstated. While it may have been shocking for its time, the film lacks the substance and artistry of other groundbreaking horror films from the same era. It is not a film that has aged well, nor is it a film that stands up to repeated viewings. I wouldn't even know why you would want to watch it again. Anyway, as we now bring this review to a close, I want to stress that my criticisms of The Last House on the Left are not just about its technical shortcomings or its tonal inconsistencies, although those are certainly significant issues. My main criticism is that the film feels utterly devoid of purpose. It is a film that wants to shock, but it has nothing meaningful to say. It is a film that presents violence in the most graphic and disturbing ways possible, but without any insight or commentary on that violence. In the end, The Last House on the Left is a hollow exercise in exploitation, a film that seeks to provoke without offering anything in return. For these reasons, I firmly stand by my initial assessment. The Last House on the Left deserves no more than a rating of 1 out of 10. It is a deeply flawed film that fails on almost every level, narratively, thematically, and technically. While it may have been groundbreaking at its time, it has not aged well, and its legacy is more of a testament to its shock value than its quality as a film. If you are looking for a thoughtful exploration of violence, revenge, or the human condition, you will definitely not find it here. Instead, you will find a film that is crude, disjointed, and ultimately forgettable. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into The Last House on the Left. If you enjoyed this analysis, feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments below. What are your opinions on this controversial film? Does it deserve the cult status it has achieved, or is it, like I believed, an overhyped, undercooked relic of the 1970s exploitation cinema? Let me know. As always, if you enjoyed this review, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more in-depth analysis of horror classics. Until next time, stay safe, and remember, sometimes it's only a movie, but that doesn't mean it's a good one.